Hello, Champion Patriots. John Di Lemme here, the founder of Conservative Business Journal and the host of the CBJ Keyword Real News podcast show. And we're excited tonight to bring to you a very special guest, a true patriot, a true warrior, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeier. And guys, get ready for this. Many of you have heard his story. He's the author of the incredible book, Irresistible Revolution, Marxism's Goal of Conquest and the Unmaking of the American Military. His book, Irresistible Revolution, was published in May 2021, at which time Matt was a respected active duty commander in the newly formed U.S. Space Force. For publishing and speaking about his book, then Lieutenant Colonel Lohmeier was relieved of his command, aka fired, and subjected to an Inspector General investigation launched from the Pentagon. Lieutenant Colonel Matthew, my friend Matt, welcome to the show tonight, and we appreciate you. And all my listeners and followers and subscribers know, grab a pen that writes, take some notes. This is an episode you're going to want to share as an American, because you're going to hear a true American story. Welcome, Lieutenant Colonel.
John, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, we're excited to kind of unpack a little bit your stories. We said we're going to kind of a long form interview, which is excellent. And I wrote a book about champions, and some people do not know this about you. And I did some research on you, and I'm excited to unpack our time together. You were a basketball state champion, I heard, huh?
I was,
how you won a state championships in basketball, and you play a little bit better when the Air Force recruiters were looking at you. And this is key. This is key, guys, as we start this incredible career to the point of being fired because you talked about CRT in his book.
You're the first interviewer out of many dozens probably in the past year that's ever brought that up. So I applaud you for your good research. I played on a state championship basketball team in Arizona, competitive basketball in Arizona, and ended up getting recruited to play at the Air Force Academy, which is frankly how I got into the school. I was a mediocre student in high school, much better basketball player, and had the best games of my life when Air Force was watching. That started my sophomore year of high school. And some of the worst games of my life, my junior and senior years, when other universities came to watch me play that I was interested in attending. But it turned out that it was supposed to be that way, I suppose. Went off to the Air Force Academy. Only played for 1 year. And my hat's off to those at our service academies who were able to balance their military obligations with their intercollegiate athletic obligations. It's a really hard balance at our service academies.
And for you too, with your background too, it wasn't like you come from a strong military background either. And this is an incredible story. And I believe how God has utilized your story and where you're at now to really expose all the Marxism and the racism and the critical race theory and your expertise. I mean, your book is power-packed about the evolution of where it began in the 20s, and we'll talk all about that. But just share with everyone, how some people have a military background. And my dad's listening. We talked earlier. He's 92. He's a vet. He saw battle. No, he worked in the office. We call him Paperclip Philly. So my dad's name is Phil Di Lemme. So he's on tonight. He's listening. But so share with everyone how you really didn't have a military background and how that's important for everyone listening to this. This is key.
Yeah, my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, had served for a very brief period of time during the Korean War. I don't think and I mean very brief. It was a matter of months actually. And so, beyond that, they had a large family. No one else had served in the military. My father was a lifetime career UPS driver, well over 20 years that he was a UPS driver, and then also a feeder driver at nighttime for UPS. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, excellent mom. And in fact, just spoke with them on my way here to chat with you tonight. But the fact is, I never had any real ambition to serve in the military while I was in high school, despite a good upbringing, despite being taught properly. Sometimes, each of us recognize the importance of this great nation at different periods in our lives. And it wasn't for me until I had been at the Air Force Academy for a season, had an incentive flight in a T-38 in between my sophomore and junior year, recognized I wanted to fly jets for the Air Force. And slowly but surely, I started to study history, started to compare our system of government with other places in the world and the lived human experience of others in the world. Had an opportunity to do, in fact, an exchange while I was a cadet at the Air Force Academy. to the Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force Academy in a place called Changchun, which is north of North Korea. And it was my first exposure to Marxism, Marxist ideology, and the type of one-party military that they experienced there in the PLA at their academy. It's a horrible place compared to our Air Force Academy, and all of our Air Force Academy cadets thought that we had it rough. But I was grateful to get back to the U.S. and come back to the U.S. Air Force Academy after my short sojourn over there in China. But yeah, it was a process of many years, in fact, that I really came to greatly appreciate what it is that we've been built upon here in this country, our founding philosophy, our ideas and ideals, and just how much progress for humanity we've made in this country.
That's right. And I believe with your background too, with the conservative values, and just so you know, you tell your family, I actually, one of my jobs, I worked through college, I worked the graveyard shift at UPS. I was packing the trucks from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. during college for one of my 3 jobs I worked during college, as my dad wouldn't give me any money. I had to actually work 3 jobs during, when people go, John, how come you don't drink? Work at a liquor store going through college. You won't drink because you see everybody coming in drunk as can be. But back to the show. But that traditional conservative values, then you went on. I want to give you some accolades here, what you achieved. Matt began his active duty military career as a pilot. Pay attention, guys. Flying over 1,200 hours in the T-38 as an instructor pilot, followed by flying the F-15C. After flying, he cross-trained into space operations and gained expertise in space-based missile warning. Matt promoted 2 years below the zone to lieutenant colonel, graduated top of his classes, earning him the Distinguished Graduate DG Award at 4 different Air Force schools, and served as an AD camp for a 4-star general for 1 year. In October 2020, he transferred into the United States Space Force and was placed in command of a space-based missile warning squadron in Colorado. A stellar rock-solid foundational career. And then let's go to the point to when all of a sudden you start to, I've written many books as an author. I understand one day you say, you know what? I need to get this message out. And your book titled Marxism's Goal of Conquest and the Unmaking of the American Military. And you are definitely a highly educated man in America about Marxism, communism, Karl Marx, and where it began. So when did you make the decision to start to pencil this book, and then realize that day, I know as a writer, you're saying, I'm gonna lay this out. Then you did that infamous interview on a conservative podcast show. Then you got fired.
Right.
So kind of tell everyone what was going through your mind when you start to hear this, the CRT training. And sometimes it's even, like you said, it's even some daily trainings in some branches of the government now, military.
Yeah, well, this will need just a little bit of time to unpack, and feel free to interrupt me whenever, of course. But I'll back up 2 years roughly from when I took command of a Space Force missile warning squadron. I got a couple of master's degrees that the Air Force sent me to get, one of which was in military strategy, and we studied Cold War history a great deal at a strategy school called the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. It's out at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. And while I was there, I took extra interest in the history of Marxism and Marxist revolutions. I had found a copy of, I know it's not hard to find, but I found it in the library, the Communist Manifesto that's written by Marx and Engels in 1848. I read that for the first time in my life while I was there as we studied Cold War history. And from there, I recognized that there was far more to the Cold War than just American involvement in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. In fact, there were many communist revolutions in the 20th century that were happening all across the globe that were inextricably bound up with Marxist ideology. And so I looked into that for some time. I spent a great deal of time, in fact, looking into that, but it wasn't the first time in my life that I'd become interested in political ideology or history. That had been a long time interest of mine, but the specific focus on Marxism happened at that strategy school. Now, fast forward to the time when I come into command, it's just after George Floyd's death. Right. And your viewer and listener.
Just interject. This is an important pivotal point. I mean, that weekend when they were about to open up the entire country, George Floyd's death, and this is I've done my research to interview you. You're a tremendous story, tremendous American patriot. Guys, pay attention to this pivotal point about that infamous George Floyd situation in Minnesota.
Yeah, so your viewer and listener will recall the things that began happening in this country in the aftermath of his death. You saw windows being smashed in. You saw Black Lives Matter surge and get a tremendous amount of additional funding from the left. And the things that were happening in broader American society, to include the critical social justice activism that you saw all over social media, mainstream media, on university campuses, and unfortunately even in some of our some of the business sphere, we were not immune from in the United States military. We had from the lowest of the ranks, young activists, not many, by the way. I mean, we've got great patriots in the U.S. military, but we had some activists, and you know how just a few activists can completely wreck the culture of an organization if it's left unchecked. And they were parroting things on their social media, for example, advocating that cities burn to the ground in this country, just like we saw from Black Lives Matter activists in this country, things that should have landed them outside of the military, in fact, because it's radical active political activism that simply doesn't have any place in our armed forces. But unfortunately, it wasn't just them. It was people in the senior ranks of our armed forces that, from an official platform in uniform, with the help of the public affairs department of the Defense Department, and in my case, the Air Force and Space Force, they were putting out videos injecting race identity politics into the lowest level. One example of that, I'll give you a couple of examples. We had the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Brown, in uniform on video saying that he's afraid every time the police lights come on in the rearview mirror because he's afraid he'll be the next George Floyd, for example. We had people like him saying, "I'm a Black American first."
That was a video that they played like at a training for the Space Force and Air Force. You say they injected videos. That was through the Department of Defense.
That was official distribution to every email account in the Defense Department. He had a Black, very well respected until that point in time, senior enlisted leader called the command chief, the command chief in charge of all the Air Force, the enlisted personnel. And this senior enlisted leader was making similar officially produced videos talking about race identity politics, talking about how he's afraid of the white oppressor class in this country. And when you get that kind of activism, and that was just the beginning, and that was just the least of it, in fact. But those are some of the earliest things that our service members saw. And I'll tell you, that really bothered a lot of our service members who they sign up because they love their country, and in many cases, regardless of their political affiliation. But they're trained to be apolitical. They're trained to sniff out political or politically partisan behavior because they know they're supposed to avoid it. And then they see this kind of left-wing race identity politicking activism coming from senior leaders. And there was a climate of fear that was instantly generated across the services. If you speak out against this, you're going to be labeled something awful.
Well, that's as I talk on my shows, that's a truth wisdom bomb you just dropped, Lieutenant Colonel Matt. You said, wow, there was an atmosphere of fear. There was a climate of fear, atmosphere. Can you unpack that a little bit? Guys, that's a huge statement, because then they're starting to get controlled by not speaking the truth, and meanwhile they're protecting who we are as citizens. Share that, please. That's a huge statement.
You know, well, about that same time, we had begun having officially sanctioned diversity and inclusion trainings. Okay, they wear the mask of diversity and inclusion, which they've defined a very particular way, but it's social justice activism. It's rooted in Marxist ideology. In fact, it pits the oppressor versus the oppressed. And in recent history in the university campuses and now in our military, it is the white citizen and service member versus the Black citizen and service member. Something, again, that never entered into anyone who's listening to this who's served in uniform knows very well that just hasn't ever been a part of their military service, the Black and white divide. In fact, as Thomas Sowell has said, something like, racism isn't dead altogether in this country, but it is kept alive by race hustlers and politicians who have something to gain by keeping racism alive. And that's exactly what we see in the military that's been going on right now. It was pushed, unfortunately, before Biden and the Biden administration came to office. It was of course, during the last year of the Trump administration. And when I saw this kind of activism unfolding within the ranks in my own unit, I tried on the one hand to shield people in my unit from political activism that was falling downstream, as it were, from senior leaders,
and how would you
including
do that?
From an activist base commander. What's that?
How would you shield them? I think that, and that's because it's dangerous to get those ideas in their mind. In other words, how would you potentially shield them, Matt?
Well, for example, and I was going back into the Trump administration. I'm going to go back there in just a minute. Let me fast forward and talk about a great example that the nation heard about after the Biden administration came to office and appointed Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to his position early in 2021. He issued a memorandum to all commanders and senior enlisted leaders across all branches of the military that they were to take a down day or to take a knee from their official missions or their training missions to discuss extremism in the ranks, was how he put it. Now, everyone knew based on comments he had made in the Senate and House Armed Services Committee hearings what exactly he meant by extremism in the ranks. It was white nationalism, white supremacy, systemic racism. That's the radicalism and the extremism that he had in mind. So there was a at least in the Air and Space Force, a 70-page training manual that was presented to me that I was asked to then share in a day-long discussion with my unit about the problem of extremism. So when I say I tried to shield my service members from some of this radical left-wing propaganda, I looked at the objectives that were laid out for me in this training manual, and I met those objectives, fulfilling my obligation, but I didn't share any of the BS propaganda that was in the training manual that they provided for us. We talked about America's founding values and philosophy. I talked about the Declaration of Independence. I talked about their oath to support and defend the Constitution against all of its enemies, foreign and domestic. Things that are not by nature or should not be politically partisan. They're things that every service member should have a great deal of pride in. So we talked quite a bit about that. But I'll tell you, going into that training, I had a number of my officers come sit down with me, unsolicited by me, in my office before the training event that we held in March or April of 2021. And they said, "Hey, sir, I've seen the memo that's come out from the Secretary of Defense. I've seen the training manual. I'm extremely uncomfortable where this is headed." I mean, our service members didn't sign up for this kind of politicization. They've got a mission to do, by the way. In my unit, it was space-based missile warning. And instead, we were going to take a knee and we were going to talk about a left-wing political and social agenda.
I mean, what does that have to do with space-based missile warning? So you were basically protecting our space, and that was a great division of the military put into place by President Trump. I mean, so you got some incredibly talented military team there, space-based missile warning. Yet they got to take a knee to learn about it. I mean, it's comical, but it's deadly. I mean, you must have been like 70-page training manual. This is insane, like a missile warning or extremism.
Yeah, you know, the priorities that the Secretary of Defense laid out for the force when he came into his position, he said that there were certain national security priorities or national security threats that our force needed to be aware of. White supremacy was one of those, global climate change was the other, and COVID-19 was the other. Everyone in uniform, regardless of their politics, in fact, thought, are those really the greatest national security threats that we face? And he continued to beat that drum for a very long time. And so here's a point that I want your listener to be aware of. People would naturally, especially if they're conservative, they'd naturally tend to think, well, conservatives ought to hate that. Democrats are loving it. It's not true that just conservatives in the military hate this. Democrats and Republicans both in the military are disincentivized when we politicize the military, regardless of the type of politicization. And your listener needs to be aware of the fact that we're going to hurt our retention and recruitment efforts on both sides of the political aisle if we politicize the armed forces, because none of them signed up to be a part of a politicized military. None of them did. They got their hairs chopped off on day one in basic training and put on the same uniform, regardless of their economic stratification growing up or their race, whether they had two parents in the home or one. And the bullets of our enemies don't discriminate. They're taught that from day one. And so when they show up in uniform and they're constantly to what they can appreciate as actually political rhetoric, they start asking themselves hard questions like, is this really what I want to do with the rest of my life? That's a tough position to put our service members in.
And then when you look at the 70-page training manual, and then when they fired you, they got the call and you did the interview and you released the book, and what was the comment that
Yeah.
that people would want to make a joke about being fired from President Trump? But on a serious note, and it's funny when you put your name in Google, all that comes up is you being fired everywhere. You got to
Right.
go and do a deep search, and obviously go to your website and find out more about you. It's just, I mean, the media is a joke. All of my listeners, subscribers know that. I mean, that's why
Yep.
we're feared by them. But I mean, when you say you were, let go, and it was they try to silence you, and all you're doing is speaking out more and exposing more. Then we're going to really get into the depths of your brilliance and understanding equity and equality and wokeism and everything that they're trying to pump out there. So tell us how it went down, what you did, the interview, and then then you got the call.
Okay, so I'm going to back up now just briefly to the Trump administration in September of 2020, just before the election. President Trump signed an executive order banning the use of Marxist-rooted critical race theory vocabulary in our diversity and inclusion trainings, and all such trainings were to cease in the federal government agencies and in the uniformed services. And I'll tell you, because there's a lot here on this call that we haven't unpacked yet, but that was going on at my base and other bases throughout the Defense Department, there was a great sigh of relief that our service members breathed when that executive order was signed by President Trump. I mean, he was trying to preserve unity in our armed forces, for example, because this stuff is divisive. It's terribly divisive. And he was trying to preserve unity, which he understands is the strength of our military. Well, I had been talking with my chain of command about the problems I was facing at my own base, and all of them up and down the chain said, yeah, this is a big problem. It shouldn't be happening. We got to take care of it. But they didn't seem to have, this will sound funny to some of your listeners, but again, those who have served in the military will appreciate this. Regardless of the rank, they seem to lack the power to make any substantive change to what was going on. And they should have dug in their heels and taken a hard stance and said, hey, this political activism has to stop, but they didn't. So fast forward now a month, and this wasn't stopping at my base, despite the president's executive order. There was activism from the base commander in contradiction of the executive order. And so I filed a formal written complaint with the Space Force Inspector General's office. Unfortunately for me, it was filed 2 weeks after the presidential election took place. It was in November. And the three-star general who sat on that complaint through November, December, and January waited to see what the outcome of the presidential election would be, in my opinion. January 6th happened. January 7th, I received a written notification that my complaint essentially had been dismissed. And no action, in fact, was being taken. And so at that point, I determined I'd write a book.
Good.
This isn't a thought that I had looming in my mind for many months as I want. No one wants to write a book unless you're crazy like John Di Lemme or some other author. I mean, it's like, that's hard work, and you know it.
It is. I respect. Thank you. It is. People think that's right.
That's hard work. So it wasn't until then that I spent 3.5, 4 months straight in my free time. I was full-time commander. I'd go home in the evenings and on my weekends, and I'd take a day of leave here and there. And I wrote what I had spent over 20 years kind of amassing and distilling into my mind as an understanding of how this stuff works. And most recently had studied about Marxist ideology. And I put it in the book, published it in May. I got it out as fast as I possibly could because this is time-sensitive stuff. We're at a critical juncture in American history. And you'll get a kick out of this. Fortunately for me as well, it was like within a week of publication that Mark Levin announced his book, American Marxism, was going to be forthcoming. I was really grateful to get mine to press before he got his to press. I didn't want to get sued or anything. So I didn't know about his book when I wrote mine, but his is a worthwhile read as well. So I published it in May. 1 week later, I spoke about it on this conservative podcast that you mentioned. It was with Creative Destruction Media. Todd Wood, the CEO of that organization, interviewed me for a 30-minute long form interview. And I did my best to describe what was in my book, but I didn't consider it politically partisan. You know, that's the thing about Marxism. It shouldn't be politically partisan. But the following week after that interview, and I didn't criticize my chain of command. I was actually complimentary of my chain of command and their efforts to stop this activism. I wasn't critical of the Biden administration, although it was very deserving of my criticism as a service member, but that's off limits. It was off limits, and I tried to toe a line very carefully. And so, nevertheless, I was fired a week later on May 14th, And the allegation was political partisanship while acting in an official capacity, which I deny still to this day. And so they opened an investigation, and I heard nothing for 3 months from my chain of command or the Space Force Inspector General's office, because frankly, they put themselves in a hard position. They knew I hadn't done anything wrong. There were disclaimers in my book. They knew I had filed complaints with the Inspector General's office that had been disregarded or dismissed. And they thought, well, how are we supposed to hold this guy accountable that we've now fired, who's now in the national headlines because we fired him, when he didn't do anything wrong? That's a tough spot for them to be in, and I suppose they ought to be in that position if they make those decisions.
That's right. That's right. And it's amazing. I mean, to hear the evolution of that, you didn't have, you weren't, the motive wasn't to write the book and originally, but you try to do the right thing, file the complaint, file the report, and then they waited to 2 weeks after the election was, as we know, handed to them through some, as you know, I speak about election corruption, lack of integrity after January 6th. And then boom, you see, you know what, enough is enough. I'm going to take your 20-year history and really expose the Marxism and all of the communism and definitely the wokeism that's getting into the military. So, you know, something that I heard you share, and I was doing my research to have you on tonight as a guest, and you guys, make sure all of you share this real quick, stay send notification. Make sure you guys follow us on Telegram, Rumble, and Cloud Hub at our channel, CBJ Real News, CBJ Real News, and share this episode. And also make sure you download our podcast app on your smartphone. Go to Google Play or the Apple Store. Search out our podcast is Conservative Business Journal. Conservative Business Journal. It's a free app. Subscribe. There's tens of thousands of subscribers. And as you know, there's a search feature by library of episodes. So you put in Matt's last name, Lohmeier, Lohm, will come up. Just hit that little share and share it to your family. You know, this is what we do. Share it to your family, friends, especially people in and around the military. And that's how we get the real news out. Then also you guys can visit conservativebusinessjournal.com. Under podcast, library of episodes, alphabetical order, under the letter L, you'll see Matt's episode. Share it. Get the real news out. And we appreciate all of our sponsors and supporters that make this possible for all we do. And you guys know that. You can visit conservativemarketplace.com, conservativemarketplace.com, and shop. As you know, we offer a vax-free, mask-free shopping experience that supports conservative businesses, 150 plus products at conservativemarketplace.com. So, Lieutenant Colonel Matt, wow, shared a story about how long it took from the 1920s, almost 30 years to get the goal of Marxism and the infiltration versus now with social media. Guys, what he's going to unpack right now is why all the social media is against us conservatives, because they're utilizing it to get the infiltration of the communism and Marxism.
Well, you know, I just spoke last week at the Colorado School of Mines, had a 3-hour conversation on a school night with an eager group of learners, and where I liked to start with them that evening, and they knew a surprising number of dates, so kudos to them. But I asked them when the Bolshevik Revolution had concluded, which was, in most historians' assessment, the first successful communist state that's established as a result of a Marxist revolution in history, and that's 1917. And from there forward, you see the establishment of communist parties in states, governments all throughout the world. Our own is just a couple of years after that. Communist Party USA is established, and we get to the period you're talking about. Communist Party growth in this country doesn't really pick up rapidly in the decade that follows, in the 1920s. But when you get to the next decade, in the 1930s, think of what's happening in Germany, and a bunch of people flee Germany when the Third Reich comes to power, including a bunch of Marxists from Germany that come to Columbia University. And they set up I think it was called the Teachers College or Teachers School. And the Communist Party USA numbers boom in the 1930s in this country in the lead up to World War II. It's remarkable. It goes from, I think, probably just under 10,000 to well over 30,000, maybe 40,000, because of some of the activism that takes root within the university setting. I mean, it gets its roots in the university very early on, and there's something called the critical school of thought. It's really a kind of literary criticism that's established at that time that slowly morphs until you get to the 1960s period. It morphs into something called critical legal theory. These are not my terms. These are actual terms. And it sought to undermine See, the impulse in the 1930s and 40s was to undermine all things Western civilization, to divorce the common man from the founding values of Western civilization, the Judeo-Christian values of Western civilization. You start by criticizing civilization. All things Western deserve criticism under the critical school of thought. Well, that morphs into the 60s into the critical legal theory or critical legal school of thought. And the legal system, specifically in the West, comes under scrutiny and criticism. And then its most recent manifestation, again, it takes years, quite a number of years, to develop into something that's called the critical race school of thought or critical race theory. And, most Americans didn't hear about that before a year ago or 2 years ago, perhaps, unless they had been in the university campus setting in the East Coast. But this is something...
At the key point you just said, Matt,
Yeah.
You said on the East Coast, Columbia, Yale, Princeton, all the Ivy League schools on the East Coast. It's a huge point, everyone listening, what he's saying, because they have to educate and teach people in the university settings, and they get the degrees, and people think they're smart, but they're educated on the wrong principles. Wow.
Well, one of the questions I'm often asked is, how is it that our senior military leaders could so easily give in to this kind of rhetoric or this kind of subversive ideological impulse, for example? And it's not always witting that they do. The Defense Department prides itself in sending our officers and senior officers to some of these Ivy League schools and some of the best university campuses, in theory, in the country. In fact, Hillsdale College is probably better than all of them from what I've been seeing in the past couple of... we've got some good colleges in this country who are willing to stiff arm this kind of left-wing political activism and actually try and teach history. But unfortunately, even private religious schools I'm seeing are giving in, and a lot of it's unwitting. They give in to a few activists. But our senior military leaders go and get educated at some of these university campuses, and by, year after year, they have a soft spot for some of these ideas, or they think that it's right or kind or just or equal or something like that, fair perhaps, to allow or to tolerate some of these radical left-wing ideologies. And what they don't understand is that when they get root, they'll absolutely destroy you. They'll absolutely destroy culture. They'll absolutely destroy civilization. And so that's, the critical race theory, which in my book, I trace a direct lineage to Marxist ideology all the way to the present social justice activist movements like Black Lives Matter. They're clearly rooted in Marxism. They don't always, of course, and most often don't go by a term like Marxist or Marxism. Marxism and communism wear any number of masks, go by any number of names, and what they're best at is usurping language and redefining terms so that it can plant new ideas in people's minds and divorce them from their founding values.
That's huge. I love that, redefining. It's something just doing as a fellow author, the definition of a word. They're defining a word differently, so it's received by somebody, gets planted in their mind, then they start to believe it, and then they act on it. And something also I like to ask you, Matt, when you got that call and you got fired, people cower. At that point, you got demonetized. You got shut down by the radical left. You're in the media. They say, you know what, stop talking. We're going to fire you. And did they give you any ultimatum to get your position back, to get your job back, as they do to many of us that get fired? But you had obviously a stellar career. That's why, as we built up to this on our show tonight, this was as you heard, his career over a decade plus, 15 plus years active and highly acclaimed success in the Air Force with all the missions and so forth and training. And what went on when they fired you? Like when you had the conversation with your wife and your family, and at that point, I don't think you had your 1-year-old at that point. I don't believe, right? You got 2 kids, you got a couple of youngins, right? As we say.
Yeah.
So what went through your mind about that point when you hung that phone up and you're sitting there as a man, as someone that's got a military career and obviously a lot of accolades, a lot of success? What'd you say?
On my way, so I was called in on a Friday afternoon, that was May 14th, to my immediate supervisor's office. He was a colonel, okay? On the drive in, it was a short drive. I live on base, and his office is on base, and so was my office. So I had about a 2-minute drive. And during that 2-minute drive, I received a phone call from a military.com reporter called Oriana Pollock. and Oriana Pollock was calling to ask what my feelings were about being fired from my command. Now,
You didn't even know yet.
hadn't yet been fired. And I said, hey, that's pretty interesting. You've got your timing wrong. Why don't you call me back in a little bit and we'll chat about it? And I went in.
Wow.
On the phone was a 3-star general, Stephen Whiting. His name is public, and he's been in the news as well, so I don't feel bad, mentioning some names. He's essentially a public figure. He fired me for alleged political partisanship. After I hung up the phone, I was told that I'd be escorted to my office by a fellow lieutenant colonel to gather up all of my belongings the following morning. It was a Saturday morning. I wasn't told in any way, shape, or form I'd be getting my job back. It was a done deal. And I was told I'd be under investigation. Now, get this too. Here's another irony. It's a sad thing that they put themselves in a tough spot. I had a clear conscience. I didn't do anything wrong. I was trying to inform
Right.
people, frankly, of some activism that needs to be put in check. Otherwise, we'll lose our military. But he said, you're being relieved of your command because you've been politically partisan while acting in an official capacity. And now I'm opening an inspector general's office investigation to determine, and get this, whether or not you've acted in a politically partisan fashion. So the very reason for which I was fired was the subject of the investigation that followed my firing, with no stated intention of hoping to clear it up that I might get my command back. So I'm escorted the next morning. By the way, in case my tone sounds bitter, I'm really not bitter about this. It's just a really unfortunate turn of events. I wasn't even bitter then, although it was very sad.
Like what you said, you said you have a clear conscience because you did the right thing. Integrity never needs to be disguised.
That's right.
It's something as you get to know me better, Lieutenant Colonel Matt. We live in integrity. I believe the most important core of someone is integrity and honor. When you tell the truth, you never have to remember what you said. That's right. My dad and my grandfather's, that's the old full-blooded Italian from Europe mindset, like shake someone's hand, look them in the eye and tell the truth. I mean, you have a clear conscience when you do the right thing. We had a discussion today about that, Christy, right? Yeah. And some other things going on. It's so important to always tell the truth. And that's why, for you and for everyone listening, this is how God will utilize some of your story for just huge growth. I mean, it's just doing the right thing. And they saw you as a high HVT, a high value target. Get him out. Mm-hmm. Like, get him out because he's exposing stuff, and little they do is poke the bear. So.
Yeah, some people, to your point, I won't try to name which ones. Maybe I would in a private conversation. We're deliberately trying to get the HVT out of sight, out of mind. And there were genuinely other very high-ranking senior military leaders who I think probably even agreed with what I had done, and who simply had to turn their back. They didn't have to. I shouldn't say it that way. They felt compelled to turn their back on me and align with the system because of fear. They feared retribution. They feared being labeled a racist. They feared being labeled a bigot. They feared being labeled politically partisan and having their career end. That's all unfortunate. I mean, to some degree, our service members give up. To some degree, they give up their free speech. Not wholly, certainly not wholly. That's a right we all retain. But for example, you're not allowed to criticize your chain of command or the President of the United States, the sitting commander-in-chief. There were young service members, though, who actively were criticizing their commander-in-chief, Donald Trump, from their social media platforms, and me calling them out on that, for example, that's political partisanship. I'm the politically partisan one because I'm trying to hold left-wing activists accountable for their activism. You don't do that. You don't hold them accountable. And so there was a climate of fear, and we've talked about that earlier in the show, and that's exactly what it was. Same climate of fear that is generated every time there's a Marxist revolutionary spirit or impulse afoot. You see it in 1966, 67, in Mao's Cultural Revolution in China. The People's Liberation Army senior military leaders who are not willing to bend the knee and confess their sins, and we saw a lot of that in the last couple of years, apologize for your privilege and this kind of thing. They were pulled up onto stages in the public square, and they were brutalized physically, emotionally. So were their families. And I had to ask myself, I write about this in the last chapter of my book, Irresistible Revolution, where were their peers? their fellow general officers who wore stars on their shoulders. How come they weren't stepping up and defending their fellow general officers who were being tortured on a stage? Well, it was fear.
That's right.
They're afraid. And so,
and that's what they do with just intimidation. And real quick here, let me show. I want to show all of our listeners on the video side your book there. So make sure you guys, wherever books are sold, Irresistible Revolution, Marxism's Goal of Conquest, and the Unmasking of the American Military. Powerful must read. And you got all of those symbolism there on the book cover. And you also had an experience. You actually spent some time in China, I believe.
Yeah.
Lieutenant Colonel, correct? Just share upon that, guys. This is a must read. Pick up 5, 10, 15 copies. Read it yourself. Find certain pages that you believe will relate to people who are uneducated about the deadly effects of Marxism and communism and so forth, and educate yourself. I believe as a reader, that's how we educate ourselves. So make sure you guys do, once again, wherever books are sold, Irresistible Revolution, Marxism's Goal of Conquest, and the Unmasking of the American Military. And then share everyone your story. You spent some time in China. You're like, I cannot wait to get home. That's the enemy's court. I want to get back and play basketball on my home court, home field advantage.
I actually played a basketball game there in front of the entire People's Liberation Army Air Force Academy student body, and they had it all filmed, and they were going to put it out as propaganda to probably all across China, for all I know. But I was there with a delegation in 2005. It's in a place called Changchun. It's north of North Korea. It was March. It was incredibly cold. And there were only 4 of us that went. It was me, 2 other guys, and a girl. And they put us on a basketball team. None of us were basketball players, by the way, except for me. I was a basketball player.
Did they know that? Did they know you were a basketball player? Did they know that?
No, they didn't know, but what they had in mind, I'm sure, was to embarrass the American delegation.
Yeah, but all of a sudden they got the ball in your hand and you tore it up.
Well, I did, and I got some cheers out of the crowd, but we were absent, and they put us with one other Chinese PLA student cadet on our team so we could have 5. And we played a team of their best 5 from the PLA Air Force Academy, and we were absolutely crushed. They used us to mop up the court for the better part of an hour, and it was all on video. And I'm sure they sent out, hey, look, the U.S. sent their best and the brightest out here, and we absolutely crushed them on the basketball court. But while I was there, that was actually, it's been 17 years, I guess. That was my first introduction to the word Marxism, in Chinese, Marxism. And I asked these young people, I slept in the same barracks or dorm room as a couple of other PLA Air Force cadets. And we were talking about everything under the sun in the short amount of time that we had together, and beliefs came up. And they said that they believed in Marxism. And I asked, is that how you were raised? And they said, no, I was raised Jiao. I was raised Dao Jiao. I was raised Jidu Jiao, Buddhist, Taoist, or Christian. There were different belief systems from which they came within rural China, where they came from. But once you joined the military, you were part of a one-party system, and it was all Marx.
And that's that word again, one-party system, which they're trying to do here in the States.
That's precise. So right now what it takes is dividing the military. You have to there's a lot of patriots, a lot of good people in the military who don't like what they're hearing and what they're seeing. But you force policy upon them, you force ideas on them, and you insist that they shut up and color. You're going to by and by have for yourself within the military a one-party system. It's really dangerous. It's really scary. It doesn't take long either. We've seen in this country just how quickly these things take place. But that's what I saw in 2005 at the Chinese PLA Air Force Academy. Had one more interaction with colonels and general officers from the Chinese PLA Air Force when they came. When I was a brand new lieutenant in the Air Force, I was at a 5-week program at that same base, Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, and a delegation of Chinese PLA officers came through, and they asked the student population, hey, does anyone speak Chinese or have any reason to come and be able to help out with this delegation who's here from China? And I said, I can do it. I mean, I went on an exchange there, met a lot of these guys.
You look like you speak Chinese.
Yeah, I look kind of Chinese. But anyway, I've had some interactions with them. Human nature is the same.
Sure.
We demonize them as an enemy, and rightly so from a government political perspective. But what's fascinating is that what Marxism can do to some Chinese people, it can also do in the West. What Marxist ideology has done in numerous countries all throughout the globe in the 20th century, it can also do in this country. It can unmake your military. It can create a kind of visceral, emotional energy between citizens in this country where they absolutely hate each other. They don't trust each other, and they want violence against one another. That's why I chose to write a book, is because as a trained military strategist who happens to also have studied Marxist revolutions to some degree, I felt like I was uniquely situated to be able to tee up the very problem we're facing. And it's just, I title my book The Unmaking of the American Military, but I'll tell you, it's actually the undoing or unmaking of our country in the process.
I mean, and when you look at this, you know, the unmaking of it, I think I said unmasking a couple of times too, didn't I say? Did I say unmasking?
You may have. I hear it both ways. You may have said unmasking. I've heard a number of people say that, so I don't correct people anymore. I'm used to hearing it.
I guess it was so used to
unmaking,
right? Yeah. But it's unmaking. I apologize if I did. I apologize, my mistake. But when you look at the unmaking of the American military, I mean, it's literally the unmaking of it. And I want to make sure you guys visit also Matthew's website. It's MATTHEWLOHMEIER.com. It's his name, Matthew Lohmeier, MATTHEWLOHMEIER.com. Two final questions for you. This is such, like Carol said, this is such an educational interview. And yet it's heartbreaking what is happening while we have been sleeping. I mean, it's so educational because for two reasons. Take a stance in life, don't cower down, educate people, go out and do it. And two things I want to ask you. We hear a lot about equity and equality. Can you unpack that, please? What the difference is and what that means?
What's so compelling about the language is that it's rooted in both the human spirit, but in America's founding values. This idea of equality resonates with all Americans. The unfortunate part for all of us is that because the radical left Marxist agenda usurps language and changes definitions, is that what perhaps we mean by equality in its deepest, truest sense is a kind of equality of opportunity for all people, because we're created by God, we're created with certain inalienable rights, and therefore, regardless of our race or background, etc., we all in this country have this opportunity before us to succeed based upon our hard work or our merits and so forth. What is meant by equity now, and the Marxist left, is a forced equality of outcomes. And they throw around words like fair in there as well to shame people, or they weaponize something that's so important to the American people to further their purposes. But equality of opportunity doesn't mean anything anymore. It's a kind of state enforced or compelled equality of outcomes, regardless of merit. And now think about that. Now, whatever organization wants to take on that kind of mantra for themselves, go ahead and do it. But one organization that the taxpayer should be absolutely concerned does not adopt that line of thinking is our American military. It is a it's a meritocracy. It's a merit-driven organization. You want your best performers holding the weapons in their hands and executing a mission, period. Doesn't matter their race. Doesn't matter if they're poor growing up. None of that matters. You want lethal people in jobs that require lethality, because the job of the military is to defend us and to defend the Constitution. So that's the primary difference. There's so much great material out there. If you just simply look into this now too, the viewer, the listener, people are trying to parse out the differences between some of the old language that we would appreciate and the way it used to be understood or defined, and how it's just slightly been modified in our day to mean something different, and it's weaponized. It's weaponized language.
And it's so important. Once again, Lieutenant Colonel Matthews Lohmeier's book, Irresistible Revolution: Marxism's Goal of Conquest and the Unmaking of the American Military. And it's so important. So I know I said two questions, but I lied a little bit. I want to ask you two quick ones. Wokeism is what wokeism means. And then the final question about interview. And I appreciate your time tonight. Tremendous conversation. Tremendous interview. Guys, make sure you share this. And I know our team's going to edit some sections and send it out. I know many of you that are our followers and subscribers. This is a true patriot, true warrior. as I wrote this down, the final point, in wokeism, there's no, a missile doesn't have a color, right? There's no
well,
color.
they do have colors, but not
Wait a
races.
minute, that's a racist missile. I mean, it's so idiotic. So what does wokeism mean?
Okay, because you've got two questions and we're short on time, I'll be as brief as I can. This might seem like an overstatement, but it's not. I'm convinced. I've studied this quite a bit in the last couple of years. I'm going to call wokeism an anti-God religious cult.
Good.
Okay, so let's leave it at that, and then people can parse that out however they want. I will point people to someone who's done quite a bit more work on this. There's a number of people, but recently I just met him in Miami. So James Lindsay of New Discourses has done a good amount of work on unpacking some of this. If you're wanting to listen to 3 hours or even 20 minutes, he's got all sorts of videos at New Discourses, and he does a great job, but there are many others.
And then revolution, and Nikki said, thank you for getting this information out, gentlemen. We appreciate the guys. So many reviews and live reviews live on the show, and this is going to go viral as we wrap it up. Revolution, obviously, that's the main title of your book, Irresistible Revolution. As an author, the title of the book is very, very powerful. I see Kevin is on. Kevin is a Black conservative, and he was in the military, in the Air Force, and he worked on the. He was an engineer, right? He worked on the. He was a mechanic. He worked on all of the. He kept you guys flying good. He kept the engines running. He's listening tonight. He says,
"Good,
thank you for your service." So, revolution. I know as an author, book title is important. I was so excited to ask you this question. Irresistible revolution. What is a revolution? A Marxist revolt, a revolution.
Thank you. Well, we're used to calling our founding fathers conducted a revolution, and we often refer to the Revolutionary War. Not all revolutions are created equal. I want to actually answer the question by focusing on both words, irresistible revolution. I got the title from one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, who said it was the role of the artist to make their Marxist revolution irresistible. And the way that they do that was to tee up a narrative of human affairs that is simply irresistible to the hearer. So when you create a title of an organization, something like Black Lives Matter, what good American doesn't agree with that sentiment? Of course, decent humans agree with the sentiment. And so they, again, we've talked about this, but weaponize language so that then if someone does choose to take a stand and say, hey, I disagree with your platform, instantly they can have a finger wagged in their face and told, well, there clearly must be something wrong with you. It's not wrong with our platform. It's not wrong with our movement. They've attempted to make their revolution irresistible. The reason I've titled my book Irresistible Revolution, because my book is about the underlying politically ideological impulse beneath all of the current critical social justice activism that we're seeing, that's actually unmaking our military, unmaking our country, threatening our churches, threatening our public education system. It's everywhere. And I happen to be able to write about how it's impacting our military. And for a good number of people in this country, unfortunately, it has become irresistible. And a way to fix that problem is by helping educate our population about what these people are really up to. These people not just being Black Lives Matter, but any of these left-wing activists who hate this country, who are interested in seeing it burn. You have to educate people so that they can become active and help others.
And that's such, because that word irresistible is a very strong word. Something is so tempting. It's the lure. It's the fake, fake bait. You're fishing. You're giving a lure. It's better. They want to make it better than the real bait. And it's irresistible. And that's irresistible. As an author, I respect that word. It's a powerful title. Irresistible Revolution: Marxism's Goal of Conquest and the Unmaking the American Military. Make sure you guys search out the book where books are sold. Grab a hold of numerous copies. Make sure you also visit Matthew's site, MatthewLohmeier.com, MatthewLohmeier.com. Any other final words you want to share before we wrap it up? Tremendous show, incredible wisdom, incredible. It makes me proud to be an American. Can you share? Do you want to share how you, I know I said I'm going to end it shortly here, but when you said the story about you represented Space Force in that Thanksgiving with all the Americans with President Trump?
I'm glad you brought this up. Your listener already knows that the mainstream media is very corrupt. And I spent 4 hours in a room on Thanksgiving Day after the election in 2020. Okay, I was the sole voice representative for the Space Force, and we had a representative from the Air Force, a rep from all of the branches of the military in their various respective rooms, waiting to get on a video call with the president or commander in chief, so that he could thank us for our service and we could wish him happy Thanksgiving. We sat there for 4 hours, waited. The president shows up. We have an hour-long, roughly, conversation with the president. We all got to hear good stories and had banter back and forth, as you could imagine President Trump would have with the troops. He said nothing about the election that had taken place weeks earlier, although we'd seen on social media and in other platforms, he's very actively engaged in trying to fight the election fraud that occurred. And the next morning, I wake up and read in newspapers that President Trump has a call, and these are my words. I don't remember what the titles or the headlines were, but President Trump has a call with the service members, and all he can do is complain about the outcome of the election. It was totally false. And so firsthand, my service members and anyone else that was paying attention got to see just how full of lies the media is. And I'll tell you one way we can combat that. It's hard as can be to combat. I mean, we're in a fog of lies and a fog of war of sorts. But the best way to combat that is to learn the truth and speak the truth boldly. And that takes some effort. But, you know, folks that are already plugged in and listening to shows like yours and watching shows like yours are already on the path to trying to understand and appreciate what reality looks like, and then trying to articulate that for others.
Wow. Guys, what a powerful show. Once again, make sure you share this, follow us on Rumble, Cloud Hub, and Telegram at CBJ Real News, our channel CBJ Real News, and share the episode. Make sure you do subscribe and submit your best email address at our website, conservativebusinessjournal.com. Make sure you get the app on your phone and share it. Make sure you do grab a hold. Once again, I have to do one more final, as we say, promotional. Now, I wrote a book about capitalism. I believe it's a great book to invest in and purchase numerous books. Make sure you guys grab a hold of Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeier's book, Irresistible Revolution, Marxism's Goal of Conquest and the Unmaking of the American Military. God bless you. Tremendous show. Thank you guys for all the sharing and comment. And then Lieutenant Colonel, just hold on for 1 second when we end the show here. Thank you guys. God bless you. Share this, and this will definitely go viral, I know, on a podcast platforms everywhere. Thank you. Good night, everyone. God bless you.